Kansas Territory, June 1872. The sky was wide and sharp blue above the tallgrass prairie, and the wind carried the scent of wild sage and river dust. Dane Vexley had been riding west since sunrise, no particular destination, just the habit of a man who had been on his own too long. His horse, Bandit, snorted and slowed near a break in the grass. That was when Dane saw her, a woman. White dress torn at the hem, veil caught on a thistle. She was collapsed in the grass like she had fallen from the sky. Her bare feet were scraped, her hands dirt-streaked, and she was unconscious. Dane dismounted fast, dropping to his knees beside her. "Miss," her chest rose and fell shallowly, and her fingers twitched against the earth. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, with dark lashes and tangled brown hair pinned with pearls. Her cheeks were pale, but there was a new bruise near her temple. The kind that did not come from falling. He gently lifted her into his arms. She was light, but he held her like she might break. Bandit followed at a slow walk as he carried her back toward his cabin, tucked a mile or so south of the river. By the time they reached it, the sun was beginning to dip low. Dane pushed the door open with his shoulder and crossed to the cot near the hearth. He laid her down, removed what was left of her tattered veil, then fetched water. She woke an hour later with a sharp inhale, bolting upright. "Whoa there," Dane said, setting the tin cup down. "You are safe." She blinked fast, looking around the small cabin. Her voice was hoarse. "Where am I? My place. Found you unconscious about a mile east. You are hurt." She touched her temple, winced, then looked down at her dress, her eyes filled with something between shame and panic. I ran," she whispered, "from a wedding." "Mine." Dane sat back on the edge of the table, arms crossed. "That explains the dress." She looked up at him then, really saw him broad-shouldered, sun-browned, with eyes the color of Colorado timber. He was not smiling, but there was something steady in his gaze that made her chest loosen a little. "I am Blythe Kersey," she said softly. "I was supposed to marry a man named Ellis Harrow in Atkinson. He owns a freight company. My father arranged it. You did not want to marry him," her throat bobbed. "He is not kind." Dane nodded once. That was enough. He pulled a thick blanket from the trunk and handed it to her. "You can rest here tonight." "I will keep the fire going." Blythe hesitated, then took the blanket with both hands. "Thank you for carrying me, for not asking too many questions. I reckon you do not owe me answers, not unless you want to give them." She looked at him again. He was plain-spoken, quiet, not the type to push. She had never met anyone like him. The next morning, Blythe woke to the smell of coffee and eggs. Dane stood by the stove, cooking, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hair damp from washing. She sat up slowly, wrapping the blanket tighter around her. He looked over. "You hungry?" She nodded, unsure why her heart beat a little faster when he handed her a plate. "I can help with chores," she offered. "I am not used to sitting idle." He looked at her for a moment, then gave a short nod. "You can gather eggs. Coop is just behind the barn." "Watch your step, one of the hens is mean." That was how the days began to stack up. Blythe stayed. At first just until her ankle healed, then because the idea of going back made her stomach twist. Dane never asked her to leave. He built her a bench by the front window, showed her how to fish with line and hook, and let her talk when she needed to. She learned he had been a cattle wrangler in Texas once, before his brother died and he sold everything. Now he kept to himself, bartered with neighbors, and passed through towns only when necessary. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun drop behind the cottonwoods. He was quiet for a while. "Peace is hard to come by, found some here. Figured I would hold on to it." She nodded, her fingers curling around the edge of her shawl. "You got family still in Atkinson?" he asked finally. "My father," she said. "But he made it clear marry Ellis or leave his house. I chose the road." Dane glanced at her then. "Takes grit." "Doing what you did." Blythe met his eyes. "I was terrified. Still took grit. One night, a summer storm rolled in fast, lightning cracking over the fields. Blythe got up to close the window, but the wind slammed it shut first. She flinched, stepping back too quickly and knocking over the oil lamp. Dane was there in 2 strides, steadying her, his hands warm on her arms. "You are all right." Her breath caught. He was close, his face inches from hers, his voice low and sure. "I am just jumpy," she murmured. He nodded, but he did not step away. His thumb brushed the edge of her sleeve, then dropped. "I will fix the lamp." He did. But something changed after that. She started noticing how he looked at her when he thought she was not watching. And he started noticing how she smiled more when she was near him. Summer deepened. The grass turned gold, the sky broader. One morning, Blythe was kneeling in the garden when Dane came back from a ride. He dismounted, tied Bandit to the post, and walked straight to her. "I need to ask you something," he said. She stood, brushing her hands on her skirt. "All right. I know this was never your plan, ending up here, but I would like you to stay." She stared at him, heart pounding. "I do not just mean a few weeks longer," he said. "I mean I want you here with me." "For good." Blythe's lips parted. "You do not even know if I can cook without burning things." He smiled a little. "I will risk it." She took a step closer. "You are asking me to build a life with you." "I am." Her hand touched his chest, just over his heart. "Then yes." He leaned in, slow and certain, and kissed her like he had waited years. When they pulled apart, her eyes were shining. "You really carried me out of the grass. You were the first good thing I had seen in a long time," and she believed him. They spent that night on the porch again, wrapped in the same blanket, watching stars blink into the dark. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he held her hand in both of his. She did not dream of Atkinson anymore. She only dreamed of this cabin, this man, and the life they would build from the ground up. Together. By late July, the heat pressed down like a heavy quilt, and the air shimmered over the prairie. The days had slowed, thick with sun and quiet labor. Blythe had begun rising before the rooster crowed, stepping out barefoot to feel the cool earth under her feet before the dust and heat took hold. Dane would already be up by then, out by the corral checking the fence line, or gone to the nearest homestead to trade for flour or salt pork. One morning she found a pair of leather gloves folded neatly on the bench by the door. They were small, clearly not his. She turned them over in her hands, brows lifting. "You make these?" He looked up from the sharpening stone, knife in hand. "Neighbor owed me a favor. Figured your hands could use protecting." Blythe slipped them on, flexed her fingers. "They fit." "You've got a narrow grip," he said, going back to his blade. Later that day, they worked together repairing the barn's north wall where the boards had warped and pulled apart. Blythe held the planks steady while Dane hammered, the rhythm broken only by the low call of meadowlarks and the occasional scrape of metal on wood. She pulled a nail from the pouch at her hip. "You ever think about building more?" "A second room, maybe." "I have," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Just didn't make sense when it was only me." She didn't say anything, but her smile lingered as she handed him the next nail. A week passed. Then another. When the river rose from a sudden downpour, they spent an evening hauling stones to keep the water from creeping under the cabin. Blythe worked beside him without hesitation, her dress soaked to the knees, hair plastered to her neck. Afterward, they sat on the porch steps, rain drumming the roof above them, and she leaned her head against his arm without asking if she could. "I used to think I wasn't meant for this kind of life," she said, voice hushed under the rain. "Not just the land, but the quiet." "The steadiness." Dane didn't move. "What changed your mind?" "I started wanting it." In early August, they rode west to the edge of the county to help a widow named Alma put up fencing. Alma's late husband had been a friend of Dane's, and she lived with her 2 sons in a sod house that clung to the earth like it was hiding from the wind. Blythe took to the boys immediately, showing them how to braid rope and make dolls from corn husks. Dane worked with Alma in silence most of the day until the sun edged low and the posts stood straight. That night they slept in the hayloft of Alma's barn. Blythe curled under a quilt, Dane stretched out beside her on another. "Alma asked if we were married," she said in the darkness. "What did you tell her?" I said not yet. Dane didn't answer right away. "Then, would you want to be?" "Yes." He rolled toward her, the hay crackling beneath him. I haven't got a ring. I don't need one. I haven't got a preacher either. I don't need one of those yet either. He reached for her hand in the dark, found it easily, wove their fingers together. When they returned home, the prairie had turned a deeper shade of gold. The cottonwoods by the creek had begun to drop their first leaves, and at night the wind carried a hint of the season coming. They spent one afternoon gathering plums from the trees near the bluff. Blythe climbed the lower limbs barefoot, her laughter echoing as she tossed fruit down into Dane's waiting hands. "Careful," he warned, watching her shift her weight higher. "I was careful the first 20 times," she said, plucking another plum. "You're not going to stay up there forever, are you?" "Maybe." He reached up and tapped her ankle. "Then I'll have to build a ladder and come get you." She looked down at him, hair tangled, cheeks flushed. "You do that. I'd build whatever I needed to." That night, she baked the plums into a tart that burned slightly at the edges, but Dane ate every bite without a word. She only noticed when she scraped the pan clean and saw the dark line of sugar crust. "You didn't say it was overdone," she said, narrowing her eyes. "I was raised not to criticize a woman's cooking," he replied, straight-faced. "Well, I was raised not to let a man lie to my face." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Then I'll tell the truth next time," she squeezed his fingers. "Don't, I like you better this way." The next morning he came in from the barn with dust streaked across his shirt and a folded paper in his hand. "Found this in town yesterday," he said, placing it on the table. "Figured you should see it." It was a notice from Atkinson, her name printed clear. Reward offered for information on her whereabouts. Her chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. How recent? Week-old. Maybe more. She looked him in the eye. "Are you afraid they'll come?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I'll be standing between them and you." She flattened the paper with one palm, then pushed it aside. "Then we should make it official." He was quiet. "I mean it," she said. "Marry me, Dane. You asking me?" "I am." He stood, came around the table, and pulled her to her feet. "I'd marry you every day if I could," he said. "Once'll do." They held each other in the middle of the kitchen, flour on the counter, sunlight through the window warming the floorboards. There was no grand speech, no polished promises. Just two people who had already chosen one another, again and again, in every quiet act of care. And that was enough. September settled in slow, the kind of month that softened the land without warning. The wind shifted east, cool and dry, and the prairie grasses dulled to amber. Blythe rose early still, but now her mornings began at the table sewing muslin into curtains, her needle steady while Dane chopped wood just beyond the window. Their days moved with quiet rhythm, nothing hurried, nothing wasted. One evening, Dane returned from the Harrow ranchlands with a sour look carved into his face. He unsaddled Bandit in silence and set his rifle back on its hooks without a word. Blythe stopped stirring the stew and turned. "What happened?" "Ran into a man near the old toll bridge," he said, voice flat. "Wearing a suit sharp enough to cut granite, East Coast drawl, asked if I'd seen a woman fitting your description." She held the wooden spoon tight. "Did he give a name?" "Thomas Averill." "Said he was hired by Ellis Harrow to bring you back." Her jaw tensed, but she didn't speak right away. She ladled stew into 2 bowls, set them down, then sat. "You tell him anything?" "I told him the prairie's wide and I don't keep track of ghosts." Blythe touched the edge of her bowl but didn't eat. "He'll come again." "Maybe." "What if he brings more men?" Dane's gaze didn't shift. "Then they'll find I'm not alone out here." Later that night, she stood by the door, watching the fields darken. Dane lit a lantern near the bed, the glow warming the walls, and crossed the room. "You still want to marry me?" she asked, his brow furrowed. "What changed?" "I don't want it to feel like we're running out of time. We're not. I want it written down, witnessed. I want the world to stop calling me someone else's." Dane stepped closer, his voice quiet. "Then let's ride to Alma's first light. She's got a Bible and straight enough handwriting. Her boys'll witness." Blythe nodded, tears rising sharp and fast. She leaned into his chest, breathing against the fabric of his shirt. "I'll wear the blue dress," she said. "I'll wear my cleanest shirt," he answered. They rode out before dawn, hoarfrost silvering the grass edges. Alma welcomed them with a knowing smile, her hands stained with blackberry juice from canning. She pulled down the thick family Bible and opened it across the table. The vows were spoken with no more than 10 words apiece. Alma's youngest handed them a sprig of sage from the yard and called it a bouquet. Afterward, they sat beneath the cottonwood behind the house, Blythe resting her head on Dane's shoulder as the boys chased chickens around the coop. Alma came out with a tin box and handed it to Blythe. Inside was a ring plain, worn smooth with time, the silver band dulled but unbent. "Was my mother's," Alma said. "She'd rather it warm a finger than sit in a drawer." Blythe slid it on her hand, her voice caught. "I'll take care of it." "You already have," Alma said, then turned and went inside without waiting for thanks. On the ride home, Dane reached over and took her hand, their fingers laced together across the space between saddles. The next few days brought no sign of Averill. Still, Dane stayed close to the house, rifle cleaned and leaning by the door. Blythe didn't ask questions, she just hemmed curtains in silence and added dried yarrow to the stew pot. One night, Dane spoke as they lay together, the lantern casting soft light across the rafters. "I used to think I'd go my whole life without this," he said. She turned to face him, her hand against his chest. "Without what?" "Waking beside someone who doesn't flinch when I speak." She ran her fingers along the line of his collarbone. "I don't flinch because I trust you." "I trust you too." The wind picked up outside, rattling the eaves, but inside it was quiet and warm. Blythe closed her eyes. 2 days later, they rode to the riverbank to gather willow bark for winter tinctures. Blythe crouched by the roots, knife in hand, while Dane kept watch along the waterline. "I never asked what you planned to be," he said. She looked up. "Before all this, before Ellis Harrow, before Atkinson," Blythe sat back on her heels. "I wanted to open a lending library. My mother taught me letters before she passed. I used to copy whole chapters of books just to read them again." "You still want that?" "I want a shelf," she said, smiling faintly. "A quiet shelf with pages that smell like dust." Dane pointed to the cabin, barely visible beyond the rise. "Plenty of wall left." That evening he surprised her with a bundle of books, weathered, leather-bound, titles faded. "Traded for them at the post," he said simply. Blythe turned each one over like it was a gift forged from gold. She didn't cry, but she didn't speak either. She lined them up on the mantel, one after another, then pressed her lips to his cheek. The next morning she began teaching him to read. They sat together on the porch steps, her hands guiding his over the page, his brow furrowed in concentration. "That one's Harvest," she said. "Looks like Harshest. Only if you're in a hurry." He glanced at her, mouth twitching. "I'm not." Autumn deepened. They stacked firewood high, salted meat in barrels, and patched the roof before the first frost. Dane carved a cradle from pine, though Blythe hadn't asked for one. He said it was for Alma's neighbor, but she saw the way his hand lingered on the wood grain. One night, as the stars came out and the air smelled of chimney smoke, Blythe took his hand and placed it just below her ribs. Dane looked at her, his eyes steady. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded, voice thick. "I think I've been sure a while." He said nothing, only leaned in and rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in like prayer. They didn't speak of names that night. They didn't need to. The fields would go bare soon. Snow would come. But their home was strong and the fire would hold. And in the quiet, in the truest kind of peace, they had everything they needed. The first snow came early, brushing the tops of the prairie grass with pale dust and settling between the logs of the cabin in thin, quiet lines. Blythe stood at the window, one hand resting on her lower belly, and watched the flakes drift sideways in the wind. The horizon blurred into white, and the world outside seemed to hush. Dane was near the hearth, shaping strips of rawhide into bindings. The smell of smoke and spruce clung to him, his hands steady as ever. "Did you know it would come this soon?" she asked. He didn't look up. "The birds flew low this week. That's always been a sign." Blythe turned toward him, her shawl slipping off one shoulder. There's a lot I never noticed before I came here. You see everything now, he said. Better than me most days. She crossed to the table and picked up the linen sack she'd begun sewing days earlier. Inside were small bundles dried berries, willow bark, and cloth-wrapped bundles of herbs she'd learned to steep for fevers. She tied the sack closed and set it beside the door. When the river freezes, Alma won't be able to ride out. I want to send this before that. We'll take it tomorrow, Dane said. Weather's light enough. Blythe watched him a moment longer, then walked over and knelt beside the fire. Did you ever think about teaching someone all the things you know? Dane set the rawhide aside. Never figured anyone would want to learn. I do, she said. Not just for this place, for what's coming. He leaned back in the chair. You're already better with a snare than I am. She gave a soft laugh and reached for a stick to stir the coals. I want to know how to read the sky like you do. How to track something through snow, how to keep this place upright when you're gone for a day. Dane's voice dropped, quieter than the fire's crackle. I don't plan on going far, but someday you might. He didn't argue with that. Instead, he stood and fetched the oilcloth map from the shelf above the door. He laid it across the table and tapped the edge. Storms push in from this bend here, he said. See how the trees lean east along the draw? That tells you where the wind favors. If the crows are silent by dusk, there's weather coming behind them. She leaned in, her hand brushing his as she traced the lines. Will you show me the rest? He nodded once. All of it. That night, she bundled a quilt at the end of the bed and carefully began stitching along its edge, her needle rising and falling in slow rhythm. She didn't say what it was for, and Dane didn't ask, but his eyes lingered on the fabric long after the lantern had been extinguished. The next morning, the snow had hardened to crust underfoot. They saddled Bandit and the mule, packed the sack of herbs and dried goods, and began their slow ride south toward Alma's. The sound of hooves on frozen ground echoed against the banks, and the sun broke through in shards of gold. Blythe rode behind Dane, her gloved hands curled around the reins, her breath white in the air. Half a mile from Alma's, they passed a wagon stuck in the ditch, its axle buried deep in the frozen slope. A boy of about 12 stood beside it, holding the reins of a spooked bay mare. His face was pinched red from cold, his coat too thin. Dane dismounted without a word and crouched beside the wheel, his hands already working at the frozen mud. Blythe handed the boy a strip of jerky and asked his name. Levy, he said. My ma's back in the wagon, she's sick. We were trying to make it to the doctor in town. Where you coming from? North Ridge. Homestead burned down 2 days ago. Stovepipe caught. Blythe's stomach turned. She looked toward Dane, who was now shouldering the wagon's rear corner, pushing in sharp bursts. The wheel groaned, then caught. Bring your mare to our place, Dane said. It's closer than the town, and there's a warm stove. Levy hesitated. She's got a cough real bad. She'll be warmer inside than out here, Blythe said. We'll make room. They guided the wagon back up the slope, moving slow, the mule tied behind. When they reached the cabin, Dane carried the woman inside. Her skin was flushed with fever, her breathing shallow. Blythe laid her in the cot nearest the fire and began steeping the last of the elderflower. She mixed it with honey and a dash of vinegar before pressing the cup to the woman's lips. As night fell, the wind picked up again, howling against the eaves. Levy sat near the hearth, eyes wide but quiet. Dane handed him a blanket and nodded toward the ladder. You can sleep in the loft, it's warmer up there. Levy climbed without a word, the bundle clutched tight. Blythe sat with the woman through the night, wiping her brow with a damp cloth. Dane brought more wood than stayed near, his presence a constant weight beside her. She's got a good chance, Blythe murmured. She's young. You did right by them, Dane said. We did. By dawn, the woman's breathing had eased. Blythe poured the last of the tea and sat back, her eyes lined with fatigue. Dane crouched beside her, gently taking the cloth from her hand. You need rest. She might wake soon. She'll do better if you can help her on your feet. Blythe leaned against him, her body heavy with weariness. I didn't think I could do this, not before. You've done more than you know." The fire snapped behind them, casting long light across the floorboards. Blythe closed her eyes and let herself rest there, safe in the space they had made, one that held strangers without question, one that had become home not through walls or roof, but through the strength of what they gave each other. Winter was only beginning. But they would weather it, all of them now together. The woman's fever broke on the third morning with a low groan and a flutter of her lashes. Blythe helped her sip broth by the fire, quiet and patient, while Dane saddled the mule for a trip into town. Supplies had run low, there was little vinegar left, and no more dried apples, but Levy stayed behind to tend the stove and fetch wood when asked. He was a careful boy, watchful, with quiet hands and an instinct for when to stay still. "Your name?" the woman rasped, her voice rasped but clearer than it had been. "Blythe Vexley," she said, dipping the cloth back in the basin. "You're safe now." The woman's eyes fluttered shut again, but her fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. She didn't speak more that day, but by evening she was sitting up, her hands trembling as she peeled a potato while Blythe stirred oats over the fire. That night, Dane returned with a small sack of sugar, a bolt of flannel, and a tin of salve for burns. He set everything down on the table and slid a folded page across the wood toward Blythe. "Marshall's notice came down," he said. "Ellis Harrow withdrew the bounty." She unfolded the paper slowly. Her eyes scanned the short paragraph, the signature at the bottom. Then she folded it again and pressed it flat against her chest, exhaling through her nose. He gave up. "Looks that way." She leaned against the table edge, her eyes still on the folded paper. "I didn't think he would." Dane stepped closer. "He's not the one who gets to decide your life anymore." Blythe looked up at him, and something in her expression shifted. "We could have a name now, for the land, for us." "I was thinking the same." They stood in silence for a moment, the fire popping behind them, then she reached for his hand. "I want to call it Sweetwind." His brow creased. "Why?" "Because the wind here never scared me," she said. "Not like it did in Atkinson. Here it feels like it's always carrying something new." He nodded, then squeezed her hand. "Sweetwind it is." By the end of the week, the woman, whose name was Ruth, had regained enough strength to stand on her own. Her voice was still thin, but she spoke with clarity. "My husband passed last winter," she told Blythe while folding the flannel Dane had brought. "We stayed on because of Levy. He loved the land, but after the fire, I was ready to lay down and stop trying." "You didn't," Blythe said simply. Ruth smiled faintly, "because someone stopped for us. Now you have a place to begin again." Ruth's eyes shone a little in the firelight. "I think we do." They stayed another week. Ruth helped mend the curtains while Levy took to the fields with Dane, learning to identify the winter barley shoots and check the traps set near the bluff. Blythe taught Ruth how to steep the herbs in proper measure, and Ruth showed her a way to dry orange peel on the stove that left the cabin smelling warm and bright for hours. Then one morning, Ruth stood at the door, her coat buttoned and Levy at her side. "We've got kin down near Salina," she said. "My sister's husband runs a smithy. She wrote last spring, said we had a place if we ever needed it." Blythe wrapped her arms around her, firm and sure. "Right when you get there." "I will." Dane lifted Levy onto the mule and handed him the reins. "He's yours now. He'll carry you quiet and steady if you treat him right." Levy reached down, grasped Dane's hand in both of his. Then he turned the mule toward the ridge, Ruth walking beside him, her shoulders no longer stooped. By late afternoon, only the wind remained. Blythe stood in the yard, her shawl pulled tight, watching the trail vanish in the distance. Dane joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "You all right?" he asked. She leaned into him. "I think I will be." That night, she lit one of the beeswax candles Alma had sent and set it on the table. Dane brought out the ledger they'd begun keeping 5 pages now, one for each week of winter, with notations for whether livestock and what still needed fixing come spring. Blythe added a new page. At the top, she wrote, "Sweetwind, week 1. She turned to Dane. "Would you mind if we added a new name to the end?" He looked at her, waiting. She reached into the trunk and pulled out a small bundle. Inside was a knitted cap, soft brown wool no larger than her palm. "We'll need it by March," Dane's breath caught, but he didn't speak right away. Then he reached out, touched the cap, and closed his hand gently over hers. "I'll build the crib tomorrow," he said. They went to bed early that night, the lantern casting long shadows across the wall. She lay tucked against him, her hand resting over his heart, and he pressed a kiss to her temple, slow and warm. Outside, snow fell again, soft as breath. In the spring, they planted potatoes and corn, then beans and squash in the southern field. Dane built a second room to the cabin, its window facing east to catch the morning light. Blythe lined the sill with books, and on warm days she sat there reading aloud while he sanded wood for the cradle. The child arrived one evening in April, born in the quiet hush between sundown and full dark. Dane held her first, his hand steady, voice low as he whispered a name into her tiny ear. They named her Aaliyah. Blythe held her close, her tears silent, her joy so deep it left no room for words. Neighbors came days later, bringing bread and dried apples and a quilt sewn by Alma's hands. Levy sent a letter, written in careful block letters, saying they were safe and working the forge and that Ruth had started keeping herbs again. That summer, Sweetwind bloomed with wildflowers. Blythe walked the ridge in the evenings. Aaliyah swaddled to her chest, and Dane joined her after chores, their fingers intertwined. They built rows of fencing together, marked the edge of the property with painted posts, and one afternoon carved their initials into the cottonwood by the creek. They never spoke of Atkinson again. They had a home now, a child, a name for the land and each other, and that was everything they needed.